Now, it's safe to say that most people haven't been to prison, but still, there are a few things that are pretty well known about the slammer. There's a strict schedule, snitches get stitches, and baby killers get killed. A lot. While prisons tend to house some of the more unscrupulous in society, they are very unwelcoming to certain types of people, especially child killers. In some situations, inmates take matters into their own hands and eliminate these child killers permanently. Want to know why baby killers instantly get killed in jail? Keep watching to find out. Liam Dean. If you've ever had to look after a newborn, then you know that they can be a handful. Let's just say that little humans are a bit noisy during their first few days in the world. Most parents of newborns try soothing them and getting them to fall asleep. But Liam Dean, a 22-year-old father from Leeds, England, did the unthinkable to his baby girl. The daughter Luna was just 2 days old when her life was cut short by her own father. The story goes that Luna's mother, Karen Bissett, gave the baby to Liam to look after and went upstairs to sleep. While the baby was with Liam, she began crying, as babies tend to do. Liam said later to the police that he got fed up with her crying and took matters into his own hands. He punched the little girl repeatedly, shook her several times, and squeezed her arms and body. Eventually, Luna would die from her injuries just days after she was born. When Luna's mother came downstairs the next day, Liam told her a completely different story. He said that Luna was struggling to breathe and had fallen and hit her head. She immediately called the ambulance and Luna was rushed to Leeds General Infirmary and was pronounced dead on July 14, 2017. But this was not the end of the story. Far from it. The doctors who examined Luna found that her injuries were not consistent with Liam's story. She had what has been described as catastrophic brain injuries, and after she was examined, alarm bells went off. Liam was arrested and confessed to police that he lost control after she wouldn't stop crying. In court, a lawyer read a statement from Luna's mother which said, "Seeing Luna on life support in the hospital will last with me forever. I can't describe how that felt. I would not wish it upon my worst enemy." After over 3 hours of deliberation, a jury reached a unanimous guilty verdict for the child killer in October 2017. Liam was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder and was ordered to serve a minimum of 10 years. But seeing as he is on this list, it's safe to say that he didn't live out his sentence. In fact, he only lasted about a month in prison before he was taken out by another prisoner named John Westland. Now make no mistake, Westland was far from a saint himself. According to news reports, he was in prison for attacking and harming women, specifically older women. In both the UK and Germany, Westland had been arrested for assaulting older women and was finally convicted of assaulting a woman in her 50s when he was just a teenager. Still, Westland has admitted that Liam's reputation made prison very hard for him. He owed money to other prisoners and was called baby killer every day. In the early hours of November 12, 2017, Liam was found dead in his cell. Westland had used broken pieces of a glass aftershave bottle to attack Liam and left him in a pool of his own blood. Liam was also found with a psychoactive substance in his system which would have made him incapacitated when he was attacked. Westland was tried and found guilty by a court and sentenced to life in prison for the murder. And while some people would see a baby killer being murdered in prison as poetic justice, Judge Rodney Jameson QC, who was in charge of the trial, did not. It is an unfortunate consequence of life in prison that those who are themselves guilty of serious offenses, as you were, will find another inmate to look down on. Given the nature of your own conviction, some might find that to be rank hypocrisy. Kristen Berry. The story of Kristen Berry and her partner Joseph Walsh is one of child neglect and abuse taken to the max. I should mention that before the death of their son Chance, which turned them into infamous criminals, they had gone through child loss before. The two welcomed a son named Dwayne in 2014, but he passed at just 2 weeks old. The cause of death was a kidney infection that stemmed from a botched circumcision. The pair went on to have another child, Chance, who was born in 2015. Now you'd think that having a baby after you'd tragically lost a previous one would make any parents jump for joy, but not Kristen and Joseph. According to reports, Kristen told her stepmother that he hated Chance. The reason? He wasn't Dwayne, the child she previously lost, and looking at him made her angry. And this was on top of the couple's history of drug abuse. Yikes! No one wants to think of a mother hating or hurting her own child, but sadly, this was just the start. In October 2015, when Chance was just 9 weeks old, Kristen's mother, Sally Morawski, went to the police and said that she hadn't seen her grandson in a month. What was worse, the boy's parents had been in a car crash in South Carolina and kept telling different stories about his whereabouts. After she made this report, authorities in South Carolina charged Kristen and Joseph with child neglect and held them on a $150,000 bond, and thus the search began. When the authorities got to the couple's home, they were met with a truly blood-chilling scene. All over the walls of the house were blood splatters, and when cadaver dogs were set loose on the property, there was evidence of what seemed like human remains. Even weirder, Chance's parents didn't seem very concerned about where their son might be. But eventually, Kristen led the police to a shallow grave 13 miles from their home in a wooded area where they discovered Chance's body. It was a horrible sight, a small child's decomposing body in a grave in the woods. Kristen and her partner were taken in and more details came to light. According to her, it was Joseph that killed little Chance on the morning of September 16, 2015. He said that he hit the boy repeatedly and that she'd told him to stop, saying, "You are going to break his effing neck." But instead of stopping, Joseph said he'd bash the baby's head into the ground. Sadly, Chance passed away from his wounds, and what his parents did next is something out of a horror story. Kristen said that she didn't immediately call the police because she didn't want to lose two people she loved in one day. So they left the baby's body in his crib for days as he decomposed. When the smell got too bad, they wrapped him in a blanket and left him in the closet for several more days before taking him to the wooded area where they buried him. In January 2016, Kristen pleaded no contest to aggravated manslaughter and got 25 years in prison. As part of this deal, she would have to testify against her child's father in a separate trial for second-degree murder. But Kristen never got to take the stand. On September 10, 2016, she was found unresponsive in her Florida jail cell. After medics attempted CPR and she was taken to a hospital, she was pronounced dead from a suicide. After losing one child and helping to kill another, she took her own life. Prosecutors were concerned that her death might throw a wrench in the Joseph Walsh case. But not to worry, Joseph got 45 years in prison for murdering his son and 30 years for aggravated child abuse. Mervin Bell. To give you an idea of how bad the Mervin Bell case was, the judge who sentenced him described his crimes as some of the most evil things he had ever encountered. I don't know what to tell you, this case is all kinds of messed up. Mervin had previously dated Tamika Mullally and was the stepfather of Charlie Mullally, his eventual victim, who was just 10 months old at the time of his tragic murder. In March 2013, it was reported that Tamika had confronted Mervin in Broome, West Australia because she heard that he had cheated. Rather than beg, talk, or do literally anything else, Marvin beat Tamika savagely, and what's worse, stripped her naked and left her in the street. She had to beg a neighbor for bedsheets to cover herself, and when the police arrived, they arrested her for assault, after alleging that Get got belligerent with them. But her father begged that they take her to the hospital due to her injuries, and they actually did. What they didn't know was that her baby was about to become Mervin's next victim. After beating up the mother, Mervin drove to her father's house, kidnapped baby Charlie, and drove him 1,000 kilometers away where he proceeded to do unspeakable harm to the child. According to reports, he intimately assaulted the child, broke his arms and legs, burned him, and left him with bruises all over his face. This went on for an agonizing 15 hours and lasted until the next morning. What's even crazier is that Charlie's family has since said that the police didn't do anything to help them. Even after they reported a baby kidnapping, the police station said that they had more pressing matters to deal with. They wouldn't trace a text that the kidnapper had made to the family, even when the grandfather offered to pay for it. It was a terrible situation. By the next day, Charlie was almost dead, and Mervin took a break from torturing the baby to buy a bottle of beer. Eventually, he ran into the Fortescue Roadhouse diner with the boy and said that he had drowned. He was immediately taken into custody and confessed to what he had done. The judge in charge of the case, Justice John McKechnie, said it was one of the more evil crimes that I have encountered. In September 2014, he was found guilty of sexual assault and murder, and a few months later was given life imprisonment and would have to serve a minimum of 27 years. Now, if you're watching this video, you already know that he died in jail. He took his own life in Casuarina prison in September 2015, but while his death was a shock to those on the outside, it wasn't as much to those on the inside. It's been reported that as far back as November 2014, he had been telling a psychologist that he thought of suicide and was thinking of ways to do it. He also left a voicemail to his sister before he died, basically saying goodbye. And let's just say he wasn't having the best time in prison. His family has said that both officers and fellow prisoners cursed at him and assaulted him. It was so bad that 2 other prisoners attacked him with a hammer months before he took his own life. And even though he had 2 family members also serving time in the same prison, they weren't allowed to visit him. His crimes and death have shed a lot of light on policing and justice for First Nations people in Australia, with the government even apologizing to Chaley's family for how they were treated.
On behalf of the government of Western Australia, Kamika and Ted, I am sorry for the way you were treated by the government and the WA police, both before and after losing baby Charlie.
There were also inquiries into the prison he was housed in and how his self-harm tendencies went unnoticed. Anthony Palma. During his lifetime, Anthony Palma committed several gruesome acts of violence against women and girls, and it took decades for him to be brought to justice. But when he was, it was nothing short of poetic. While he is most known for his 1997 crime, he had been harming women long before then. Let's take a quick look at his rap sheet. In 1979 or 1980, he had snuck into his girlfriend's house through the bedroom window and assaulted her 8-year-old sister. The year after, he had drugged and assaulted his roommate, who was just a teenager at the time. Having gotten used to harming women, he committed his most heinous crime on May 13, 1997. The victim at the center of this crime was a then 8-year-old girl called Kristen Hatfield. She was an ordinary second grader who lived with her mother, Shannon McCrossan, and little sister in Midwest City, Oklahoma. The night of May 13th seemed like any other. Shannon had put her kids to bed, and when she heard some noises from the girls' room, she thought it was just Kirsten sleep-talking. But when she woke up on May 14th, Kirsten wasn't in her bed. She immediately called 911 for help. I absolutely panicked. I ran back and forth from house to house. I eventually went back to the house and called 911. When the police came and began searching the property, they made some very disturbing finds. Not only was there blood on the windowsill and on the fence, but Kirsten's underwear was in the backyard. The authorities combed through surveillance from local businesses and interviewed men in the area, including the man who would turn out to be Kirsten's abductor. A convenience store clerk told the police that a man had asked him about Jet Drive, which is where Kirsten and her mother lived. And while the police searched high and low for some leads, nothing substantial came up. Days turned to weeks, which turned to months and even years, but Shannon didn't give up hope. Speaking to reporters, she said, "We're just looking for information. Somebody knows something that's going to help me find my little girl." It wasn't until 2015 that there was a break in the case, and it was all thanks to breakthroughs in DNA. The evidence taken from the blood from earlier and from Kirsten's underwear was linked to Anthony. This was also confirmed after he agreed to a DNA swab, and there was a positive match. Amazingly, he lived just 2 houses from Kirsten and her family. During the trial, a friend of Kirsten testified that he had stared at the 2 girls as they played, and it seemed weird. What's interesting is that from the time Anthony was arrested for the abduction and murder of Kirsten, he was already trying to take his own life. Within a month of his arrest, he slit his own wrists but survived the attempt. His trial began in October 2017, and honestly, his conviction didn't take very long. In fact, the jury needed barely an hour to declare him guilty. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even though Anthony was going to spend the rest of his life in prison anyway, his life would be cut short in a pretty violent manner. On January 11th, 2019, less than 2 years after he was convicted, Anthony was found dead in his cell. He had been beaten and strangled by his cellmate Raymond Pilato at Oklahoma State Prison. Pilato was already serving 3 consecutive life sentences for a triple murder from a 2010 shooting. He strangled Anthony with an electrical cord and laid him face down with a blanket covering his face. Anthony died from what has been described as ligature strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. While some might think of his death as poetic justice, there is concern that Kirsten's body will never be found now that Anthony is dead. Roy Whiting. Look, some people seem to have been born to do evil, and Roy Whitling seems to be one of them. He was born in England in 1959 and dropped out of school in 1975, working different jobs to get by. On the surface, he seemed like a regular guy. He got married, had a son, and got divorced. But by 1995, his violent nature began to rear its ugly head. In the town of Crawley, where he lived, an 8-year-old girl was abducted and assaulted, and there was an ongoing search for her attacker. After the authorities announced that the attacker had been driving a red Ford Sierra, a man in the area identified Roy. He was arrested and eventually admitted to committing the crime. For his cooperation, police sentenced him to 4 years in prison for abduction and indecent assault. But don't be fooled by his cooperating with the police. A psychiatrist who examined him actually said that he was likely to commit more crimes if and when he was released. But only 2 years and 5 months into his sentence, Roy was released back into society. Fun fact, Roy was one of the very first people to be added to the sex offender registry in the UK. After being released, Roy made his way to Littlehampton in West Sussex and got back to work. But just like the psychiatrist had predicted years earlier, he was back to reoffending. The victim this time was a 7-year-old girl named Sarah Payne, who lived in the county of Surrey in England. Her disappearance was like something out of a horror story. On July 1st, 2000, she had been playing in a cornfield near her grandpa's house with her siblings when she vanished. The story instantly made national headlines, and Sarah's parents went on TV several times to plead for her safe return. The police combed the area looking for her, and soon they got some tips. Someone reported seeing a girl matching Sarah's description near the highway. On July 17, 2000, the police made a tragic discovery 15 miles from where Sarah had disappeared. After examination, it was confirmed that the body was that of little Sarah. Now they had found Sarah, but what about her killer? The police had been interviewing people in the area, especially registered sex offenders. Seeing as he was one of the first people to ever be registered and how close he lived to the site of Sarah's disappearance, Roy got a visit from the police. And from the get-go, they noticed some things things about Roy that seemed off. For starters, he didn't seem very concerned about the girl who had gone missing, and his alibi turned out to be a lie. Then, another twist in the story. On July 23, 2000, Roy stole a car in Crawley and got into a chase with the police. He was eventually arrested and spent time in jail for car theft and evading arrest. It was while he was in prison that the authorities carried out forensic testing on his car, and he was then forced to confess. On the 6th of February 2001, he was formally charged with abduction and murder in a case that gripped the UK forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts, helped build a case that saw Roy found guilty on December 12, 2001. He was sentenced to life in prison and is required to serve a minimum of 40 years. But even as Roy has remained in prison, he's not exactly having a good time. In fact, he's been attacked multiple times in the slammer. In 2004, he was slashed in the face by convicted murderer Ricky Tregaskis and now has a scar on his face. In 2011, he was also stabbed in the eye. And then in 2018, he was stabbed by 2 prisoners while in his cell. He survived all the attacks thus far and hasn't joined the ranks of child killers being murdered in prison yet. Colin Hatch. During his life, Colin Hatch earned the reputation as one of the UK's worst child abusers, and for good reason. He committed a string of gruesome attacks on young boys from when he was just a child himself, and this culminated in one of the most infamous cases in British history. But let's go back a bit. Colin grew up in a very abusive household with an alcoholic father who beat him and his mother regularly. Even though he and his mother were able to escape when he was 4, he was left traumatized. Things got even worse when Colin was assaulted by a bus driver at just 12. By 15, his long and prolific life as a child abuser began. His first victim was a 14-year-old boy, and for this crime, he got a 2-year supervision order. He was barely 6 months into this order when he assaulted yet another boy, this time an 11-year-old. 3 years after that, he got a 2-year probation sentence for kidnapping and assaulting a 14-year-old boy. He also attacked a 10-year-old boy in an elevator. 3 years later, he struck again and assaulted an 8-year-old boy. The attack happened in a laundry room and the victim passed out, but luckily survived. This was the attack that began his stay in prison as he was sentenced to 3 years. His crime seemed incessant at this point, and even his own lawyer and psychologists said that he would commit more crimes if he was released. But their pleas fell on deaf ears, and he was released after serving his sentence. While he was away, his mother Sandra said that she found creepy writings where he described fantasies of hurting and killing young boys. Colin was released on parole in April 1993, but by July, he would commit the horrifying crime that would make him infamous. Sean Williams was just 7 years old and had gone to a tower block to visit a friend. This just happened to be the same tower block where Colin Hatch lived. Colin lured Sean into his apartment where he assaulted and then strangled the boy to death. After the gruesome deed was done, Colin wrapped Sean's body in garbage bags and dumped him in the elevator. A postman found the body and Colin was arrested for assault, abduction, and murder. And in 1994, the case went to trial. Colin tried to plead manslaughter and claimed that he couldn't control himself, but the jury wasn't buying it and he was given life imprisonment. In his ruling, the judge said, "In my judgment, you should never be released back into the community while there remains the slightest danger you will reoffend." Almost 20 years later, in January 2011, Colin was taken hostage and murdered by another prisoner, Damien Fowkes. Fowkes had been in prison for a string of robberies in 2011 and, believe it or not, had a bit of reputation for attacking child killers. He had tried unsuccessfully to kill Ian Huntley, another child killer, but took out Colin Hatch. He is now serving life imprisonment for murder. Robert Black. Robert Black's life was filled with instability from the start. His father is unknown and his mother left him in his native Scotland to move to Australia after he was born in 1947. He was taken in by a couple and raised as their own, but even this newfound home life didn't keep him on the straight and narrow. He was unhygienic, antisocial, a bully, and from the age of 5 developed an obsession with genitalia. He was known to put objects in his body from childhood and was constantly flashing himself to little girls. He was sent to a school for boys where he was abused by a teacher for 3 years. At 16, he began running deliveries for a local butcher and has confessed that he assaulted between 30 and 40 girls who were alone at home when he made the deliveries. In 1963, he was arrested for luring a 7-year-old girl to a park and assaulting her, and after moving to Grangemouth, was evicted after he assaulted his landlord's granddaughter. They chose not to press charges, but when he moved back to his hometown in 1966, he was arrested for, again, assaulting his landlord's granddaughter. This time, charges were filed, and he spent a year in prison. Sadly, this wasn't the end of his deviant behavior. He moved to London in 1968, where he became a prolific collector of inappropriate content of children, and in the 1980s began his murder spree. The first victim was a 9-year-old girl named Jennifer Carty, who he snatched off her bicycle in a town in Northern Ireland. Robert abducted, assaulted, and strangled her on August 12, 1981, and her body was found days later. The second victim was an 11-year-old girl named Susan Maxwell, who was abducted while coming home from playing tennis on July 30, 1982. Her body was found almost 2 weeks later in the English town where she was abducted with signs of assault. The third victim was a Scottish girl named Caroline Hogg, who was just 5 years old when she was abducted on July 8, 1983. Eyewitnesses report that Robert took her to a fairground before abducting, assaulting, and murdering her. Her body was found 10 days later, 310 miles from where she was taken. On March 26, 1986, another girl was abducted in Leeds after going out to run errands. Her body was found weeks later floating in a river. With all these murders and the similarities between them, police all across the UK went on a manhunt to catch whoever was responsible. There was a break in the case in 1988, after a 15-year-old girl in Nottingham narrowly avoided being kidnapped. After escaping the abductor, she and her parents reported to the police and he was able to give a description. Finally, in 1990, Robert was caught by the police after a postman saw him abduct a little girl and throw her in his van. He called the police, who stopped his van and found her tied up inside. When he was arrested, he said, "It was a rush of blood to the head. I've always liked little girls since I was a lad. I tied her up because I wanted to keep her until I had dropped a parcel off. I was going to let her go." A raid on his house found the inappropriate child content, news clippings from his previous abductions, and little girls' clothing. His trial began on the 10th of August 1990 and lasted only a day. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and remains one of the most infamous killers in British history. Compared to others on this list, his life ended pretty simply. On January 12, 2016, Robert died of a heart attack, age 68. No friends or family attended his funeral. Andrew Lloyd. Now don't get me wrong, child murder is horrible in any circumstance, but there are cases so horrifying that they create whole new laws for them, such as the case of Andrew Lloyd. Andrew Lloyd was a British man who had a difficult childhood. He suffered abuse as a child, had been to prison, was diagnosed with a personality disorder, and tried to take his own life. In 2005, Andrew began dating Rebecca Lewis, the single mother of a baby boy named Aaron. Within weeks of the two starting a relationship, the little boy's life was already in danger. Andrew moved in and immediately began abusing Aaron. He would flick his ears and arms, toss him on the bed, blow cannabis smoke in his face, and talk about how much he hated him. Rebecca told the court later that she heard Andrew say that he was going to smash your little head in. The abuse was so bad that Rebecca had to take Aaron to the emergency room multiple times. But despite the obvious danger to her son, she stayed with Andrew and later told the court that she was scared of him. Then on May 4, 2005, she left Andrew with her son to do some shopping. She was only gone for 15 minutes, but that was enough for Andrew to carry out his evil acts. By the time she got back, her baby was on the floor, and Andrew was trying to administer mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. While she was gone, Andrew shook the baby and hit his head against a wall. The two rushed him to both Swansea's Singleton Hospital and the University of Wales Hospital in Cardiff, where doctors tried for over 18 hours to save little Aaron. But it was too late, and the baby died from his injuries on May 5, 2005. Now let me tell you, the injuries on Aaron were extensive. Not only did he have a brain injury, but over 50 external injuries from head to toe. This was not a one-off accident. This was a child who suffered a lot of abuse before he died. The two were immediately arrested and charged. While it was no surprise that Andrew was charged, Rebecca being charged with familial homicide was unprecedented in British history. She became the first person to be charged with the crime and to be found guilty. Andrew was given life imprisonment with a minimum of 24 years to be served, and Rebecca was given 7 years in prison. While Rebecca was released in 2010 and was given a new identity, Andrew wasn't quite as lucky. On November 19, 2020, he died alone in his cell after contracting COVID-19. He was 37 years old and now goes down in history as a cold-blooded child killer. So there you have it. The world is full of terrible people who hurt everyone around them, even those as innocent as children. The only silver lining is that these people are sometimes caught and die in prison. Whether it's from a vengeful vigilante who just hates child murder or from more natural causes, all the people on our list met their end behind bars where they couldn't hurt anyone else. Want more content on the worst criminals in the world? Click the card on your screen to keep watching.